The sun hung low over the Vermont hills, a molten orb spilling lavender and amber across the sky. In the backyard of their white clapboard house, Emily Grayson knelt among the roses, her fingers buried in the cool, damp soil. Her auburn hair glowed in the fading light, strands slipping free from her loose braid as she worked. The air was thick with the scent of honeysuckle and earth, a perfume that clung to her skin like a second self. She hummed softly, a melody from their wedding day 9 years ago when the world had seemed small and conquerable. Across the lawn, James Grayson reclined in a wicker chair, a glass of bourbon cradled in his hand, ice clinking faintly as he watched her. His dark eyes followed her movements with a quiet intensity, a smile playing on his lips, soft, practiced, the kind that could convince anyone of anything. To the neighbors peering over picket fences, they were a portrait of harmony, a couple whose love had rooted deep, flourishing like the roses Emily nurtured with such devotion. "Do you remember the first time we planted these?" Emily called, her voice bright as she brushed dirt from her palms and stood. She stretched, her back arching slightly, and the motion pulled her cotton blouse taut against her frame. There was a warmth in her tone, a thread of nostalgia that tugged at something buried in James's chest. He tilted his head, the bourbon catching the light as he raised it to his lips. "How could I forget?" he said, his voice smooth as polished wood. "You were so damn stubborn about those roses. I told you the frost would kill them, but you wouldn't listen." She laughed, a sound like wind chimes dancing in a breeze, and crossed the grass to join him. Her steps were light, barefoot on the cool lawn, and she sank into the chair beside him with a contented sigh. "And you were wrong. They thrived." "They did," he agreed, reaching for her hand. His fingers slid over hers, calluses brushing, soft skin, a contrast that felt like a silent history of their years together. He squeezed gently, his grip steady, and she leaned into it, resting her head against his shoulder. The moment shimmered with a fragile perfection, a snapshot of something too delicate to last in a world that thrived on disruption. That night, they moved together in the kitchen like actors in a well-rehearsed play. The radio hummed soft jazz, its notes curling around them as James chopped onions with precise measured strokes. Emily stirred a pot of marinara, her hips swaying faintly to the rhythm, a wooden spoon tracing lazy circles in the sauce. Steam rose in tendrils, fogging the window above the sink, and the room filled with the rich scent of tomatoes and garlic. They traded stories, hers about a toddler who'd toppled a shelf of picture books at the library, his about a customer who'd haggled over a 10-cent nail at the hardware store. Their laughter mingled, easy and familiar, and as they sat to eat, the candlelight flickered across their faces, casting shadows that danced like secrets on the walls. Emily watched him, over the rim of her wine glass, her hazel eyes soft. "This is what love looks like," she thought, savoring the quiet intimacy of the moment. The clink of forks, the warmth of his knee brushing hers under the table. James caught her gaze and smiled, a slow, deliberate curve of his lips that made her heart stutter. He reached across to tuck a stray lock of hair behind her ear, his touch lingering just long enough to feel intentional. "You're beautiful, you know that?" he said, his voice low, almost reverent. She blushed, ducking her head. "Flatterer." "Only the truth," he replied, and the sincerity in his tone was so convincing she didn't think to question it. But beneath the surface something was shifting, cracks forming in the foundation, invisible but insidious like roots splitting stone. The first hint came a week later, faint as a shadow on water. James lingered at the store longer than usual, texting her at 6 p.m. with a casual, "Shipment came in late. Be home soon." Emily didn't doubt him. Trust was the bedrock of their marriage, unshaken after nearly a decade. She busied herself with dinner, setting the table for 2, but when he walked through the door at 9, his shirt carried a scent that wasn't his, not the familiar tang of sawdust or motor oil, but something floral, sharp, cutting through, the air like a blade. It clung to him, faint but unmistakable, and Emily's brow furrowed as she leaned in to kiss his cheek. "Long day?" she asked, her tone light, testing. He nodded, shrugging off his jacket with a practiced ease. Yeah, exhausting. I had to unload a whole truck myself. His voice was steady, his eyes meeting hers without a flicker of hesitation. He pulled her into a quick hug, his arms wrapping around her with just the right amount of warmth, and the scent hit her again. Jasmine, maybe, or something spicier. She chalked it up to her imagination. A trick of fatigue after hours hunched over library ledgers. But the late nights stretched on, weaving a pattern she couldn't ignore. Inventory's a mess, he'd say one evening. Or, the register crashed again, the next. His excuses were seamless, delivered with a casual shrug or a tired smile that invited sympathy rather than scrutiny. Emily watched him closely now, noting the way his phone buzzed more often. Short, insistent vibrations he'd silence with a quick glance, tilting the screen away as he typed. Just work, he'd mutter, his lips curving into that same faint smile, the one that didn't quite reach his eyes. She wanted to ask, to demand answers, but the words lodged in her throat, weighed down by a fear she couldn't name. Instead, she turned to the garden, pruning the roses until her hands bled, the thorns a welcome distraction from the unease blooming inside her. James's deception was an art form, subtle and meticulous. He'd come home with dirt smudged on, his jeans some nights as if he'd been hauling lumber, and once he even brought her a bouquet of daisies. Saw these at the market, thought of you, he'd said, his grin boyish and disarming. She'd smiled, kissed him, and tucked the flowers into a vase, never suspecting he'd bought them to mask the scent of another woman's perfume. He'd sit across from her at dinner, listening to her stories with rapt attention, nodding at all the right moments, his laughter perfectly timed. You're too good to me, he'd say, reaching for her hand, and the warmth in his voice felt so real she almost believed it. Even in their intimate moments, he played the part flawlessly. One night, after a week of strained silences, he pulled her close in bed, his hands tracing the curve of her spine with a tenderness that made her breath catch. I've missed this, he murmured against her neck, his lips brushing her skin as he moved over her. His touch was deliberate, his rhythm steady, and when their eyes met in the dim glow of the bedside lamp, he held her gaze with an intensity that felt like devotion. She melted into him, clinging to the illusion of closeness, unaware that his mind was elsewhere, replaying a different night, a different body, a different name whispered in the dark. Afterward, he held her tight, his breath warm against her hair, and whispered, I love you, Em. The words were soft and perfectly pitched, and she drifted to sleep believing them, never sensing the hollow echo behind them. The unraveling began in earnest one rainy evening, the kind where the world seemed to huddle inward.
Emily sat alone at the kitchen table, a glass of wine untouched, the clock ticking past 8:47 p.m. James had texted earlier, late again, sorry, be home by 9. But the minutes stretched into an hour, then 2. She stared at the phone, her
thumb hovering over his name, then set it down and grabbed her keys instead. She pulled on a coat, the wool damp from an earlier drizzle, and drove to the hardware store, her heart pounding against her ribs. The parking lot was empty, the store's windows dark, and the closed sign swaying in the wind. Her stomach twisted into a knot. She dialed his number straight to voicemail. Hey, it's me, she said, her voice tight. Where are you? Call me back. She waited 10 minutes, then 20, the rain drumming on the roof of her car, but no reply. Came. When she finally drove home, her hands shook on the wheel, a storm brewing inside her. He stumbled through the door at midnight, his hair damp, his shirt clinging to his shoulders. That floral scent hit her first, stronger now, unmistakable, and she was waiting in the living room, the lamp casting harsh shadows across her face. Her arms were crossed, her posture rigid, but her hands trembled in her lap. Where were you? She asked, her voice steady despite the chaos in her chest. James froze, his coat halfway off, one arm still tangled in the sleeve. At the store, he said, his tone casual, almost bored. I told you, late shipment. He dropped the coat on the couch and moved toward the kitchen as if the conversation were already over. Don't lie to me. She stood, stepping into his path. I went there, James. The store was closed. His eyes flickered, guilt, panic, and defiance flashing in quick succession. But he masked it fast, his face settling into a practiced calm. You went there? In this weather? He forced a chuckle, shaking his head as if she were the unreasonable one. I stepped out for a bit, had to grab some paperwork from the warehouse down the road. You must have just missed me. Paperwork? Her voice rose, sharp and incredulous. At midnight. And what's that smell, James? That's not sawdust. He blinked, caught off guard, but recovered with a shrug. Probably just something from the truck. You're overthinking this. He reached for her, his hand grazing her arm, but she jerked back, her eyes blazing. Who is she? The question burst out raw and jagged, a wound tearing open. He flinched, the mask slipping for a heartbeat before he caught it. What are you talking about? His tone was wounded now, perfectly pitched a sound betrayed as if he were the victim here. Don't, she snapped, stepping closer, her voice trembling with fury. I'm not stupid. The late nights, the perfume, the way you've been acting, tilting your phone away, smiling at nothing. Tell me the truth. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating, a noose tightening around them both. James ran a hand through his hair, a gesture she'd once found endearing, and sighed. A long theatrical exhale. Her name's Laura, he said finally, his voice low, almost reluctant. She works at the bar down the street. It's nothing serious. Nothing serious. The words slammed into her, stealing her breath. She laughed, a sharp, bitter sound that echoed off the walls. Nothing serious? You're sneaking around with another woman and it's nothing serious? It's not like that, he said, stepping toward her, his hands outstretched as if to calm a spooked animal. It's just, I don't know, Em. Things have felt off with us lately. I needed something. Something? She cut in, tears burning her eyes. What about me? What about us? I didn't mean to hurt you, he shouted, his voice cracking, a masterful touch of emotion, raw enough to seem real. It just happened. The argument erupted from there, a tempest of rage and pain. Emily screamed about betrayal, her voice breaking as she hurled accusations. James yelled back, his defenses shifting from denial to defiance, claiming she'd grown distant and cold, and that he'd felt trapped. Plates shattered against the wall. She didn't even remember throwing them. Words became weapons, slicing deeper with every exchange. You're a liar, she cried, her hands shaking as she swept a vase off the mantel, water and daisies spilling across the floor. You've been lying to my face every day. I never wanted this, he roared, his face flushed, eyes wild. But even then there was a flicker of control, a hint that he was still playing a part. They stood on opposite sides of the room, breathless and hollow, the wreckage of their life scattered between them. Emily sank to the floor, sobs wrenching from her chest while James grabbed his coat and stormed out into the rain, the door slamming like a gunshot. The weeks that followed were a war zone, silent but brutal. They moved around each other like strangers in their own home, their once warm routines reduced to cold necessity. Emily threw herself into work, losing herself in the library's quiet stacks while James stayed out later, his excuses abandoned for a blunt, "Don't wait up." The tension crackled between them, a live wire ready to spark. Friends noticed, whispers rippled through town, but neither cared enough to mask it. One night the dam broke. Emily found a receipt in his jacket pocket while doing laundry. Dinner, for two at a restaurant an hour away, dated the night he'd claimed to be fixing a leak at the store. The paper trembled in her fist as she waited for him in the kitchen, the clock ticking past 10. When he walked in, she didn't hesitate. "You're still seeing her, aren't you?" she demanded, her voice a blade of rage. James didn't flinch, this time. "Yeah, I am." His tone was flat, unapologetic, the mask finally off. "What do you want me to say, Emily? That I'm sorry?" "I'm not." The admission was a knife twisting deep. Then why are you still here? She screamed, tears streaming down her face. Why don't you just leave? Because I don't want to, he roared, slamming his hand on the counter so hard the dishes rattled. I love you, damn it. I don't know how to stop. Love me? She laughed hysterically, the sound jagged and broken. This isn't love, James. This is cowardice. The fight exploded, a maelstrom of fury and despair. Voices echoed through the house, neighbors peering through curtains as lights blazed into the night. Emily threw his clothes into the yard, the rain soaking them through. James accused her of pushing him away long before Laura, his words venomous but calculated. At one point she grabbed a kitchen knife, not to hurt him, but to slash the couch, cushions he'd been sleeping on, feathers bursting like a blizzard. He stood there, chest heaving, watching her unravel, his face a mix of exhaustion and something darker. Triumph, perhaps, at seeing her break. When the shouting stopped, they collapsed amid the chaos, backs against the wall, too drained to move. The silence was heavier than the fight, thick with unspoken truths. I don't know how to fix this, James whispered, his voice hoarse, a faint tremor in it. Real or feigned, she couldn't tell. Emily wiped her eyes, her breath ragged. Maybe. We can't. The air in the Grayson house hung heavy after that night, thick with the residue of shattered trust. The living room bore the scars of their last fight, couch cushions gutted, feathers clinging to the rug, and a cracked vase leaking water onto the hardwood. Emily moved through the space like a shadow, her footsteps silent, her eyes hollow. She swept up the debris in the gray light of dawn, her hands methodical, as if cleaning could erase the chaos that had erupted hours before. James hadn't come back after storming out into the rain, and she didn't call him. The silence was a reprieve, a fragile pause before the next storm. Days bled into weeks, each one a slow grind of avoidance. Emily buried herself in the library, her sanctuary of order amidst the disorder of home. She cataloged books with a fervor that bordered on obsession, her fingers tracing spines as if they held answers she couldn't find elsewhere. James, meanwhile, made no effort to hide his absence. He'd leave before she woke, return long after midnight, his boots thudding against the porch like a warning. The floral scent, Laura's scent, followed him like a ghost, and Emily stopped asking where he'd been. His silence was answer enough, but the tension couldn't hold forever. It simmered, a pot left too long on the stove, and Emily felt it in her bones, the inevitable boil-over. She began to notice things she'd missed in her earlier haze of denial. A faint lipstick smudge on a shirt collar, a bar coaster tucked into his wallet, the way he'd hum a tune she didn't recognize, and his lips curling into a private smile. Each discovery was a splinter under her skin, sharp and festering. She started keeping a mental tally, a ledger of betrayals, and with every entry, her anger grew, hot, reckless, a fire she couldn't douse. One afternoon, while sorting laundry, she found it. A folded note slipped into the pocket of his jeans. The paper was creased, the ink smudged, but the words were clear. Meet me at 8, same place. L. Her pulse thundered in her ears as she stared at it, the casual intimacy of that single initial slicing deeper than any confession. She crumpled, the note in her fist, her breath coming in short, ragged bursts. That night she waited. James walked in at 11 p.m., his hair tousled, his jacket slung over one shoulder. He froze when he saw her standing in the kitchen, the note flattened on the counter between them, her arms crossed tight across her chest. What's this? She asked, her voice low and dangerous. He glanced at the paper, then back at her, his face a mask of indifference. Nothing important, he said, shrugging as he moved past her toward the fridge. Don't you dare, she snapped, stepping into his path. Don't you dare act like this is nothing. Who's L? Laura. Is that where you've been? I sighed. A long, exaggerated exhale and leaned against the counter, crossing his arms to mirror her stance. Yeah, it's Laura. So what? So what? Her voice cracked, incredulity bleeding into rage. You're still sneaking around with her after everything? After you said you loved me? I do love you, he shot back, his tone sharp now, defensive. But I'm not going to pretend I don't feel something for her too. You don't get to control that, Emily. The words hit like a slap, igniting the fuse she'd been nursing for weeks. Control you? She shouted, her hands balling into fists. I trusted you. I gave you everything, and you've been lying to me. Every smile, every touch, every damn I love you was a lie. It wasn't a lie, he roared, slamming his palm on the counter. I meant it every time. But I'm not dead, Em. I'm not some robot who can just turn it off because you want me to. The argument detonated, a wildfire tearing through the house. Emily's voice rose to a scream, raw and unhinged, as she hurled accusations. His deceit, his cowardice, the way he'd played her for a fool. James matched her. His shouts booming over hers, blaming her for the distance that had grown between them, for the nights he'd felt invisible in his own home. Cabinets banged open and shut, and a glass shattered against the sink, its shards glinting like ice on the floor. She grabbed his jacket from the chair and threw it at him, the fabric smacking against his chest. Get out, she yelled, tears streaming down her face. Go to her then. I don't want you here. I'm not leaving, he bellowed, stepping closer, his eyes wild. This is my house too, you don't get to decide that. The standoff stretched, their breaths heaving in the charged air. Neighbors' lights flicked on across the street, shadows moving behind curtains, but neither cared. Emily's hands shook as she wiped her face, her chest tight with a mix of fury and despair. James stood rigid, his jaw clenched, defiance etched into every line of his body. It was the edge of a cliff, the point of no return. And then the twist came. A week later, Emily was at the library, her refuge from the wreckage. She was sorting returns, her movements mechanical, when a man approached the desk. He was tall, with kind hazel eyes and a shy smile that softened the edges of his face. Hi, he said, his voice gentle. I'm Daniel. I'm researching local history. Thought you might have some records I could look at. She blinked, caught off guard by his warmth, and nodded. Sure, I can help with that. They spent hours poring over dusty ledgers and faded maps, their conversation drifting, from history to books to quiet confessions about life. Daniel was a writer, new to town, with a patience that felt like a balm against her raw nerves. When he asked her to coffee the next day, she hesitated, her wedding ring glinting under the fluorescent lights, then said, yes. Coffee became dinners, then long walks along the river, the water rippling silver under the moon. Daniel listened, really listened, his questions soft, his laughter genuine. He didn't push, didn't demand. He simply was, and Emily found herself unraveling in his presence, her guard slipping with every shared moment. She didn't tell James, not at first. The irony twisted in her gut. She'd become the mirror of his betrayal. But with Daniel, there was no shame, only a quiet freedom she hadn't known she'd lost. The tension at home escalated as her secret grew. James noticed the change. Her lighter steps, the way she'd hum absently while cooking, and the faint flush in her cheeks when her phone buzzed with a text she didn't explain. He didn't ask, but his eyes narrowed, suspicion coiling tight. One night he came home early, catching her on the phone in the living room, her laughter spilling out like a melody he hadn't heard in months. She hung up quickly, her smile fading as she met his gaze. Who was that? He asked, his voice flat, controlled. A friend, she said, too fast, her fingers tightening around the phone. He didn't press, but the next day he followed her. She drove to the river, her hair catching the breeze as she met Daniel on a blanket by the water. James watched from a distance, hidden behind a stand of trees, his stomach churning as they laughed, their heads bent close, Daniel's hand brushing hers. He stayed until she left, then drove home, his knuckles white on the wheel. That night he waited in the kitchen, the lights dim, his bourbon untouched. When Emily walked in, her cheeks still rosy from the evening air, he stood, his shadow looming. Over the table. You're seeing someone, he said, his tone a blade of ice. She froze, her purse slipping to the floor. Yes, she admitted, her voice steady, unflinching. He stared at her, the fight draining from him, replaced by a hollow ache. How long? A few weeks. Why? She stepped closer, her eyes locking with his. Because I deserve to. Feel something too. You don't get to have it all, James. Laura, me, this house, while I'm left with nothing. The words hung between them, a mirror reflecting their mutual ruin. The air crackled, primed for explosion, and it came. James's face twisted, rage flaring anew. So that's it? You get to judge me, then do the same damn thing? He swept the bourbon glass off the table, the crash punctuating his shout. Yes, she screamed back, stepping into the fray. You broke us first. You don't get to play the victim now. The fight was apocalyptic, a crescendo of every unspoken wound. They tore into each other, James accusing her of hypocrisy, Emily hurling his lies back in his face. Chairs toppled, and a picture frame shattered, its glass crunching underfoot. She grabbed a stack of his work papers and flung them across the room, pages fluttering like wounded birds. He ripped a drawer open and dumped its contents, forks and spoons clattering in a metallic storm. You're a hypocrite, he roared, his voice breaking. You're no better than me. I never said I was, she cried, tears choking her words. But I'm done pretending this is enough. The neighbors called the police this time, lights flashing red and blue through the windows as officers knocked, their voices muffled, but firm. Everything okay in there? Emily and James froze, breathless, the room a battlefield of broken things. They waved the officers off with tight smiles and muttered assurances, but the damage was done. When the door closed, they sank to the floor, backs against opposite walls, the silence deafening. Hours passed before they spoke again. The house was a wreck, shards of glass glinting in the moonlight, papers strewn like ash, the air thick with dust and regret. James's voice broke the stillness, small and raw. What now? Emily wiped her face, her hands trembling. I don't want a divorce, do you? He looked at her, his eyes red-rimmed, and shook his head. No. Then we figure this out, she said, her voice firm despite the exhaustion. But not like before. No more lies. The next days were tentative, a fragile ceasefire. James didn't stop seeing Laura. He told her as much, his tone blunt but honest. She's part of my life now, he said one morning over coffee, his gaze steady. Emily nodded, her jaw tight, then replied, So is Daniel. They didn't fight over it. Instead, they carved out a new rhythm, strange and unspoken but functional. James disappeared on weekends, returning with a quiet nod. Emily met Daniel during the week, her steps lighter when she came home. They stopped hiding. No more tilted phones, no more feigned excuses. At home, they rebuilt something. Not love in the old sense, but a coexistence born of necessity and something deeper, a thread of connection too tangled to sever. They cooked. Together some nights, the clatter of pans a muted echo of better days. Emily tended the garden, James joining her with a shovel or a glass of bourbon, their hands brushing as they worked. The roses bloomed that spring, vivid and defiant, their petals a testament to survival. They slept in the same bed sometimes, not out of passion but comfort, their bodies finding a familiar fit despite the distance between their hearts. The town buzzed with gossip, scandalized whispers about the Graysons' odd arrangement, but they let it roll off them. They'd faced the worst, screamed it out, broken it apart, and somehow emerged on the other side. Not whole, not healed, but together in their fractured way. One evening, as the sun dipped below the hills, Emily knelt among the roses, her hands stained with earth. James sat beside her, his bourbon glinting in the twilight, the ice clinking softly. She looked at him, his face weathered, his eyes softer now, and smiled, a small, real thing. We're still us, she said, her voice quiet but sure. He nodded, reaching for her hand, his grip warm and steady. Yeah, we are. They sat there, the garden sprawling before them, roots deep and unyielding beneath the soil. The sky darkened, stars piercing the velvet night, and in that stillness, they found their peace. Not perfect, not traditional, but theirs. In that moment, surrounded by the whispers of the evening breeze, they felt the weight of their shared history, each heartbeat echoing the promise of tomorrow. It was a bond, forged through trials and triumphs, a testament to the love that had weathered every storm.